Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, a time of mud, monarchy, and magnificent stupidity. Get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the last few thoughts of your day soften, just a little. And let's spend some quiet time together, wandering through the long corridor of medieval laws, many of which existed because, inevitably, someone made a terrible decision. It's easy to imagine medieval life as a time of swords, saints, and solemnity. But for every shining knight and pious monk, there was also someone doing something so idiotic, so profoundly inconvenient, that the entire kingdom decided, never again. So tonight, we're not here for battles or glory. We're here for bans, the absurd things forbidden forever because one individual couldn't be trusted with scissors, fire, or basic common sense. Let's begin, quietly, with the story of a goose. The goose problem of Toulouse. In the 14th century, the French city of Toulouse was known for three things: its cathedrals, its pink bricks, and its highly temperamental geese. They were not ordinary farm birds, mind you. These were municipal geese, allowed to wander freely through the streets, fattening themselves on crumbs and civic pride. One afternoon, as the story goes, a merchant named Etienne decided that one goose, in particular, was giving him attitude. It had hissed at him, which, to be fair, is standard goose behavior. But Etienne took offense. Deep offense. So he did what any sensible, middle-aged man with too much ale and too little self-awareness would do: he kicked it. The goose, naturally, did not take this well. There was squawking. There was flapping. And, as fate would have it, there was also a monk walking by. The monk witnessed the entire event and promptly declared that Etienne had committed a moral crime against one of God's creatures. By the next morning, word spread across the city: Etienne had sinned. The goose, meanwhile, was granted an official funeral. The local bishop, never one to miss an opportunity for theater, announced a decree: from that day forward, harming a goose within city limits would be punished by excommunication. And so, because of one overly dramatic merchant, Toulouse became the only city in France where it was technically a sin to annoy a bird. Let's drift now, gently, northward, to England, where another kind of ban began, thanks to a man who was very, very bad at parties. The ale disaster of 1364. The medieval English loved ale. It wasn't just a drink, it was practically breakfast. But in 1364, a man named Walter Le Brewer decided to spice things up. Literally. Walter had heard about imported spices from the East. Cinnamon, nutmeg, a bit of ginger, exotic, expensive, and deeply unnecessary for ale. He wanted to make luxury beer. Unfortunately, he didn't quite understand how brewing worked. His concoction, according to witnesses, was so violently unstable that a barrel exploded in his cellar, flooding the street with scalding, fermented foam. It ran downhill, straight into the open market. Several people slipped. A pig drowned. The mayor was furious. In response, the city council issued a permanent ban on tampering with ale by the addition of foreign spice or unnatural heat. Essentially, they outlawed craft beer 6 centuries early, because Walter Le Brewer had invented the world's first IPA disaster. It's funny, really. The Middle Ages were full of noble intentions ruined by very small minds. One person made a mess, and an entire country got a law. And nowhere was this more obvious than in Italy, the birthplace of fashion, food, and utterly pointless regulations. The fork fiasco of Venice. In the 11th century, Venice was a glittering city built on water and arrogance. The nobles loved showing off their wealth, especially at banquets. And one particular noblewoman, Maria Argyropolina, niece of a Byzantine emperor, decided that eating with her fingers was beneath her. She arrived at the Doge's table one evening carrying a small golden instrument, a fork. 2 prongs. Pure gold. Elegant, delicate, and entirely offensive. The priests were scandalized. They called it unholy, declaring that God had given humans fingers for a reason. When Maria later died of a mysterious illness, probably unrelated to cutlery, a local preacher triumphantly declared that it was divine punishment for her fork sins. Venice promptly banned the use of forks for decades. All because one woman dared to eat pasta politely. Let's drift across the channel again, to England's medieval courts, where fashion itself became a battlefield. The shoe scandal of 1463. There was a time when medieval shoes were completely normal. Flat, simple, practical. Then, somewhere around the mid-1400s, things took a turn for the absurd. A new style appeared, the Palaine. A shoe with a pointed toe that could stretch up to 2 feet long. It was the medieval version of a luxury sports car, completely useless and designed solely to make everyone else feel poor. King Edward IV despised them. Partly because he thought they looked ridiculous, and partly because he couldn't walk 5 feet without tripping over one. But it wasn't until a courtier accidentally kicked a candle across the royal hall, setting fire to a tapestry, that Edward finally lost patience. He declared an official ban on any shoe with a point longer than 2 inches. The rich were furious. The poor were delighted. And cobblers quietly began adding secret extensions that folded under the toes, just to get around the rule. Naturally, they made it worse. The helmet ban of Prague. In the early 15th century, Prague was a city perpetually preparing for war. Citizens were encouraged to keep armor at home for safety. Which sounds fine, until you remember that people were also constantly drunk. One evening, a group of local nobles decided to reenact a recent battle inside a tavern. They wore helmets. They had wooden swords. And after several rounds of mead, they began swinging. The results were predictable. Several injuries. One lost ear. And a tavern owner who, quite reasonably, decided he'd had enough. By morning, the Prague Council declared that wearing armor in any drinking establishment was forbidden. The decree read, rather poetically, "No man shall enter with helm or harness, lest peace be sundered by foolishness." An elegant way of saying, no more drunk nights, please. Let's pause, just for a moment. Imagine the sound of a medieval city, the bells, the chatter, the smell of roasting bread, the occasional goose funeral. Each of these bands, small as they seem, tell us something quietly human. That even in centuries past, people were impulsive, vain, and oddly creative in their failures. Now let's wander south again, to Spain, where one man's obsession with fashion nearly got his kingdom blinded. The mirror incident of Aragon. King Peter IV of Aragon, known as Peter the Ceremonious, which is medieval for absolutely exhausting, loved rituals. He believed every object at court should be blessed, polished, and slightly pretentious. So he commissioned enormous mirrors to decorate his palace hallways. Not glass mirrors, those were rare, but polished silver sheets. They gleamed brilliantly in the sunlight. Unfortunately, they also acted like giant lenses. And when the afternoon sun struck them just right, the reflections focused into narrow beams of heat that began burning holes in the tapestries. One particularly hot summer day, Peter's prized peacock feather robe went up in flames. The royal council, tired of his constant complaints, declared a formal ban on mirrors of silver, bronze, or any glistening metal exceeding the size of a man's head. Thus, the world's first mirror safety law, courtesy of one overly shiny king. And finally, for tonight's first stretch of our journey, let's end with one of the strangest bans of all, the ban on dancing bears. The bear ban of 1250. In medieval fairs, bears were common entertainment. Trained, in theory, but in reality, barely manageable. In 1250, During the Feast of St. Giles in Oxfordshire, a handler named Thomas decided to show off. He'd taught his bear to dance. Unfortunately, the bear had its own artistic interpretation of rhythm. Mid-performance, it broke loose and charged through the crowd, scattering vendors, overturning pies, and allegedly eating an important piece of ecclesiastical furniture. The local lord, unimpressed, issued a decree. No bear shall henceforth dance for coin or mirth, nor be led by rope through public place. And just like that, centuries of bear-based entertainment were snuffed out, all because one man couldn't keep hold of his leash. So, we've seen a few examples of medieval absurdity tonight. The goose that became sacred. The brewer who weaponized beer. The fork that offended heaven. And the shoe that burned down a tapestry. Each one, a small spark of chaos that left behind a law. A quiet reminder that humanity, for all its progress, has always had a talent for ruining nice things. But we're only just getting started. Because for every ridiculous ban, there's a royal behind it, ready to make things infinitely worse. Let's drift on, softly, into part 2. Where kings and queens themselves became the reason certain pleasures, and sometimes entire foods, vanished forever. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If you are, that's fine. We're going to keep drifting, slowly, into the softer corners of medieval pettiness. You see, kings and queens had an extraordinary talent for banning things. Sometimes it was to assert control. Sometimes to appear holy. And sometimes, just because something mildly inconvenienced them before lunch. It's oddly comforting, really. Power didn't make them wiser, just louder. And tonight, we'll wander quietly through the candlelit corridors of royal irrationality, where entire nations lost privileges because a monarch got cranky. The peach ban of King Louis XI. Let's start with Louis XI of France, a man so paranoid, he made modern conspiracy theorists look like calm beach enthusiasts. He was known as the Spider King, not because he was clever, but because he spun webs of suspicion around everyone he met. One afternoon, while traveling through the Loire Valley, Louis was served a plate of fresh peaches. Juicy, ripe, and fragrant, the kind of fruit that makes you forget for a moment that you live in a century without plumbing. He took one bite, and immediately fell ill. It was food poisoning, of course, nothing supernatural. But Louis, never one to let logic interfere, decided he'd been poisoned by peaches. Not the chef, not the knife, not the questionable hygiene of 15th century kitchens, the fruit itself. Within days, he declared peaches an enemy to royal digestion and banned them from all court feasts. The decree lasted until his death, during which the royal gardeners quietly replaced every peach tree with plums, which were deemed more loyal. And so, for nearly 20 years, an entire royal orchard was rearranged to suit one man's indigestion. The trumpet tragedy of King Henry VII. Now let's cross the channel again, back to England, home of sturdy monarchs, perpetual reign, and spectacular overreactions. Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, was not known for his sense of humor. He'd spent most of his life surviving rebellions, impostors, and questionable relatives. So when his coronation finally took place, he wanted a celebration worthy of his new dynasty. He commissioned an enormous parade through London, banners, music, gold cloth, the works. Everything went beautifully, until one overly enthusiastic trumpeter decided to improvise. At the height of the procession, he blasted a triumphant flourish so loud and dissonant that the royal horse panicked. Henry was thrown, his crown rolled into a puddle, and the crowd gasped. The trumpeter, realizing his mistake, tried to play again, to restore the mood. It didn't help. Henry, dripping with mud and humiliation, immediately banned the use of loud or unruly trumpets in royal processions. For the next decade, English coronations were held in near silence, punctuated only by soft drums and, occasionally, a very nervous lute. The beard tax of Henry VIII. Speaking of Henrys, let's glide over to his son, Henry VIII. A man who spent half his life creating new laws and the other half finding new ways to break them. At some point in the 1530s, Henry decided that beards were undignified. Possibly because his grew unevenly, or because one of his courtiers had a more impressive one, historians disagree. But the result was a royal proclamation: no gentleman could wear a beard without paying a special tax. It wasn't huge, but it was insulting. Those who refused to pay had to shave publicly, often under the watchful gaze of officials armed with dull razors and smug expressions. Ironically, a few years later, Henry changed his mind. He grew a large beard himself, declared it a sign of wisdom, and doubled the tax so everyone else had to follow suit. Classic Henry. Consistency was never part of the Tudor brand. The blanket ban of Queen Isabella of Castile. Across the Iberian Peninsula, another monarch was having her own version of a royal tantrum. Queen Isabella of Castile, famous for financing Columbus and for being generally unamused by anything frivolous, had a thing about fabrics. One winter, she received a shipment of fine Flemish blankets for her chambers. They were luxurious, thick, and dyed with imported indigo. She loved them until she found that several servants had borrowed them to warm the horses overnight. Enraged, Isabella ordered every blanket of that fabric to be burned, claiming they carried the sin of vanity. For nearly a decade, no noble in Castile was permitted to own or import Flemish textiles. The economy suffered. The horses, notably, did not. The pipe ban of James I. King James I of England was many things: scholarly, cautious, deeply superstitious, and absolutely terrified of tobacco. When smoking reached England from the New World, people found it exotic and soothing. James, on the other hand, found it demonic. He wrote a pamphlet titled A Counterblast to Tobacco, describing it as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, and dangerous to the brain. He compared smokers to blackened chimneys and even claimed it could make your soul smell worse. Naturally, he banned smoking at court. Guards were ordered to extinguish any pipe seen within the palace walls. Unfortunately, James's courtiers were addicted. They simply began disguising tobacco as incense during religious ceremonies. It fooled no one. But the smell of holy smoke became oddly popular for several decades afterward. The onion crisis of Emperor Frederick II. Meanwhile, over in the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Frederick II, the so-called Stupor Mundi, or wonder of the world, had a very particular palate. He adored fine cuisine, experimental recipes, and absurdly detailed dining rules. But one day, during a feast in Palermo, he bit into what he thought was a roasted fig, and discovered it was an onion. Raw, sharp, and apparently offensive to his imperial sensibilities. Witnesses say he spat it out, glared at his chefs, and ordered an immediate inspection of every kitchen in the empire. From that day on, onions were banned from all royal banquets for their vulgar odor. This ban extended, rather unhelpfully, to garlic and leeks as well. Medieval Italian cooks wept quietly for years. The color blue, briefly banned by Charles VI. King Charles VI of France, known tragically as Charles the Mad, had his share of eccentric rules. Among the strangest was his brief ban on the color blue. He developed a superstition that blue clothing attracted bad luck after one of his favorite knights, dressed entirely in sapphire velvet, fell off a horse during a tournament. In his fragile state of mind, Charles decided the color itself was cursed. For several months, courtiers were forbidden to wear blue at court. Tailors were ordered to dye over existing garments, and painters had to replace heavenly blue backgrounds with safe, moral beige. When the king recovered slightly, he lifted the ban, only to reimpose it later after tripping on a blue carpet. It's unclear which incident was worse, but fashion historians agree the royal wardrobe must have looked truly miserable that year. The Great Spoon Ban of Denmark. Let's drift north now, to Denmark, home of quiet forests, calm seas, and one rather dramatic king. In the late 1200s, King Erik Klipping held a grand feast for his nobles. The tables were overflowing with stews, bread, and endless mugs of ale. At some point during the meal, an argument broke out between two guests over a serving spoon. It escalated, as medieval arguments often did, into a small brawl. The spoon, allegedly, was used as a weapon. In the aftermath, the king, annoyed and slightly bruised, decreed that spoons with pointed ends were to be outlawed in his court, as they were dangerous implements of discord. Wooden spoons became the new standard, dull and round. And so, because two noblemen couldn't share a ladle, Danish fine dining took a brief step backward into the Stone Age. The fruit ban of Queen Margaret of Scotland. Queen Margaret, wife of James III, was known for her intelligence, her grace, and her catastrophic luck at banquets. During one summer feast, she was served a bowl of cherries, freshly imported and extremely expensive. Unfortunately, one of them concealed a small stone. She broke a tooth. The court physician was summoned, which in the 15th century meant nothing good was about to happen. After a deeply unpleasant extraction, Margaret announced that cherries were an ungodly temptation and banned them from court entirely. She never ate fruit again. Her husband, rather sensibly, began importing pastries instead, which only improved morale. The apple ban of King John. Speaking of questionable fruit behavior, King John of England, infamous brother of Richard the Lionheart, once outlawed apples. Not for health reasons, not for religion, but because of a personal insult. During a visit to Canterbury, a group of locals had presented him with a symbolic apple of peace. He took it, thanked them politely, then immediately slipped on it while dismounting his horse. The incident was widely discussed, and, predictably, exaggerated. Ballads circulated describing King John the Fallen. Humiliated, he banned apples from all royal meals and ordered every orchard near London to send its harvest directly to the army. In other words, he weaponized apples out of spite. It's a strange pattern, isn't it? The higher the crown, the thinner the patience. Each ban, each decree, carried the echo of some small, personal irritation. A meal gone wrong. A misplaced spoon. A trumpet played too loud. The medieval world was, in many ways, an enormous reflection of individual moods. And because those moods belonged to kings and queens, entire countries lived under the laws of whimsy. But there's more, because some bans weren't just about discomfort or vanity. Some were about fear. Fear of change, of technology, of anything that seemed too clever to be safe. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If so, that's fine. Tonight we keep floating, softly, into that most human of instincts, fear of change. In the medieval world, invention was suspicious. Anything new was treated as an omen, or a trap, or at best, a mistake that God would probably disapprove of. If something seemed too efficient, too comfortable, or too clever, someone, usually a monk or a monarch, would ban it immediately. So let's settle in. Let the candlelight of old Europe flicker in your imagination for a moment. And listen to the stories of progress that almost happened, until someone, somewhere, ruined it for everyone. The wheelbarrow ban of Paris. It's hard to imagine that a wheelbarrow could be controversial. But in 13th century Paris, it was. Merchants had started using wheelbarrows to move goods through the narrow city streets, baskets of apples, barrels of ale, bolts of cloth. It was efficient. Too efficient, apparently. The city's guild porters, who made their living carrying goods on their backs, complained that wheelbarrows were unnatural contraptions that robbed honest men of strength. Their leader took the matter to the city council, and the council agreed. They declared that only licensed porters could move goods through town, and only using their own bodies. Wheelbarrows were banned as lazy devices unbecoming of Christian labor. It took almost a century for the rule to fade. Paris, during that time, remained a city powered entirely by sore backs and civic pride. The clock ban of Milan. In 1335, Milan was one of the most advanced cities in Europe. It had paved streets, public fountains, and an early mechanical clock tower, a marvel of engineering, driven by gears and weights. The people loved it. The priests did not. The new clock was accurate, painfully accurate. It rang on time, without fail, every hour of the day and night. But the local clergy soon realized that the precise bell chimes were making people arrive late to Mass. They'd been used to the softer, vague rhythm of the old sundials. In a stunning act of spiritual logic, the Archbishop of Milan declared mechanical clocks a threat to divine rhythm. They were banned from operating during church hours. For several decades, time itself had to pause so people wouldn't notice how much of it they were wasting. The printing press panic. You've probably heard that Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press around 1440. It changed the world. Books became cheaper, knowledge spread, literacy began to rise, all the good things. Naturally, the authorities hated it. The church, accustomed to controlling which texts existed, suddenly faced a world where anyone could copy anything. So in 1479, the Archbishop of Mainz issued a decree banning all unlicensed printing, a law swiftly copied across much of Europe. In France, printers were required to swear oaths that they would not reproduce heretical or confusing materials. In England, King Henry VIII personally licensed the presses, declaring that only moral and well-disposed men could print. Which, given Henry's track record, is a delightful bit of irony. For nearly a century, censorship flourished more than literacy did. But people kept printing anyway, in secret, by candlelight, in basements that smelled of ink and fear. Human curiosity, it turns out, was harder to outlaw than paper. The crossbow ban of 1139. Now, this one might sound more dramatic than it is. In 1139, Pope Innocent II officially banned the use of crossbows against Christians. It was, in theory, an ethical move. The crossbow was terrifyingly efficient. Any peasant with a few hours of training could kill a knight, which, to the medieval elite, was deeply uncivilized. So the church banned it, calling it an instrument hateful to God. Naturally, this didn't stop anyone. Kings ignored the ban, mercenaries used crossbows constantly, and by the next century, it had become the standard weapon in most European armies. The moral? When the powerful start banning tools, it's usually because they're afraid of losing their advantages. A lesson that's aged remarkably well. The mirror ban of Venice, again. We talked earlier about mirrors being banned for being too shiny. But Venice wasn't done with mirrors yet. They later banned making them. In the 1500s, Venetian glassmakers had perfected the art of creating crystal-clear mirrors. It was their most valuable trade secret, worth more than gold. But when a few craftsmen tried to take their skills abroad, the Venetian Council of Ten panicked. They issued an extraordinary law. Any glassmaker caught teaching mirror-making outside Venice would be executed. Their families would be imprisoned. Their property confiscated. For nearly 100 years, Venice held the monopoly until, inevitably, one craftsman escaped to France. The French learned the secret, Venice lost control, and the world gained an industry. A victory for progress, though not for the Venetian Tourism Board. The medical dissection ban. Science, too, had its forbidden moments. In the 13th century, medical students in Europe were eager to learn about anatomy. Some suggested dissecting human bodies, for study, not witchcraft. The church was horrified. In 1299, Pope Boniface VIII banned all forms of human dissection, calling it an unholy defilement of the body. Medical knowledge froze for 200 years. Doctors continued to base their understanding of anatomy on ancient Greek texts, written by people who had never actually seen inside a human being. It wasn't until the Renaissance that the ban eased, and brave, or foolish, anatomists began their work in secret. So if you've ever had successful surgery, you can quietly thank the handful of medieval scholars who ignored that particular rule. The bath ban of England. Bathing, once a celebrated Roman pastime, became strangely controversial in the late Middle Ages. Public bathhouses existed in most large cities, often social, sometimes sinful. But around the 15th century, they fell under suspicion. Disease was spreading, plagues, rashes, everything in between. And, as usual, people decided to blame comfort. In 1416, the English crown banned public bathhouses altogether, declaring them dens of corruption and contagion. People cheered, and promptly stopped washing. Ironically, hygiene plummeted so badly that disease spread even faster. By the 1600s, most nobles believed that bathing actually made you sick, since it opened the pores to evil air. Thus began the great European tradition of powdering over the problem. The coffee ban of Mecca and beyond. Not strictly medieval, but still in the twilight of that world. When coffee first appeared in the late 15th century, it became wildly popular among scholars and mystics. People stayed up late discussing theology, philosophy, and occasionally, gossip. Religious authorities were alarmed. They called coffee the drink of rebellion. In 1511, the governor of Mecca banned it outright, arguing that gatherings in coffeehouses encouraged political dissent. The ban spread briefly to Cairo and Istanbul, though it didn't last long. By the mid-1500s, even the sultans were addicted. Coffee, it turned out, was harder to suppress than revolution. The printing ban of 1515, the weird addendum. By the way, that same fear of newness extended to art itself. In 1515, the Pope issued a decree forbidding artists to reproduce religious images by print without official approval. It was meant to prevent blasphemy, but mostly prevented innovation. Woodcuts, engravings, and illustrations that could have taught thousands were instead hidden away. Artists resorted to secret initials and coded signatures. The Renaissance bloomed anyway, just a little slower. Progress, like sleep, always finds its way through the cracks. The chimney ban of Prague. Here's a curious one. Prague, in the 14th century, banned chimneys. At least, for a while. Before chimneys became standard, houses had central hearths and holes in the roof. When a few clever masons began building enclosed flues, neighbors complained that the smoke made their own houses colder. They claimed it was unnatural, that smoke must rise through open air, not through pipes like a devil's breath. City officials, valuing harmony over health, banned chimney construction. Several years later, half the town burned down, because, of course, open hearths are terrible fire hazards. The law was quietly repealed. No one mentioned it again. The iron ban of Ethiopia. Let's drift southward now, out of Europe entirely, to medieval Ethiopia. During the reign of Emperor Zara Yaqub in the 15th century, blacksmiths were briefly banned from working with iron. The emperor had been told that blacksmiths used their skills for sorcery, creating charms, talismans, and devil's blades. He outlawed metalwork in several provinces, claiming it corrupted the divine order. Of course, tools, weapons, and farming equipment immediately became scarce. The empire nearly collapsed economically before Zara Yaqub realized that, perhaps, hammers were not inherently evil. The ban was lifted, and the royal treasury paid compensation, mostly in the form of goats. The mechanical animal ban. finally, one of the strangest stories of all. In 1252, an inventor presented King Louis IX of France with a clockwork bird, a small mechanical marvel made of brass and spring steel. It flapped, chirped, even bowed when the king entered the room. Louis was impressed, then terrified. He declared the device unnatural and accused its maker of witchcraft. The inventor fled. The bird was destroyed. For nearly a century afterward, any mechanical toy in France was considered suspiciously demonic. It wasn't until the Renaissance that mechanical art returned, with clocks, automata, and elaborate musical boxes. But for a brief moment in time, one brave little bird had nearly invented robotics, and gotten itself exorcised. Progress, in the medieval imagination, was always a threat. Every new tool was a test of faith. Every invention carried whispers of danger. Yet, despite bans and burnings, despite suspicion and superstition, people kept creating. The mind kept moving forward, even when the law stayed behind. It's strangely comforting to think about, that humanity's curiosity never quite sleeps. Even in an age that feared light, someone was always trying to make it brighter. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? That's fine. If you're still drifting with me, it means your mind's probably halfway between the waking world and something quieter. A perfect place to talk about nonsense. Because tonight, we're wandering into the most mysterious corner of medieval law, the bans that don't make sense. Not politically, not religiously, not even comically. They just exist. Written down, enforced with utter seriousness, and now preserved in old parchment as tiny monuments to confusion. No one knows quite why they happened. But that's what makes them lovely, strange, unnecessary fragments of humanity, echoing softly through the centuries. The snail racing ban of Burgundy. Let's begin gently, in Burgundy. Beautiful vineyards, calm hills, and, in the year 1443, a royal proclamation forbidding the public racing of snails for coin or wager. It's the kind of sentence that makes historians pause and rub their temples. Because to ban snail racing, there must have been snail racing. And not just one, enough to cause disturbances of order. Apparently, local taverns had developed a fondness for tiny contests, placing snails on the table, drawing chalk circles, and betting which would cross first. A game of patience, ale, and poor decision-making. Someone, perhaps a losing gambler or a humorless priest, decided it had gone too far. Thus, the decree. Snail races were outlawed, and fines were imposed for mockery of the animal kingdom. Medieval life was hard. And it seems, for a brief moment, too many people had found comfort in the slowest sport imaginable. The singing fish ban of Lübeck. Next, we drift north, to the port city of Lübeck in the 1300s. A place where the sea met superstition. According to records, a local bishop once banned the singing of fish upon pain of fine. Which sounds odd. What scholars think it means is this: fishermen were performing superstitious chants to make the fish sing, that is, to attract them into nets. The bishop called it heresy, claiming it mocked divine creation. But the wording remained literal: no singing fish. Some manuscripts even include marginal notes wondering what sort of fish had voices. No one corrected them. It's strangely poetic, though, a medieval city silencing imaginary melodies on the water, just to feel safe from sin. The hat ban of Augsburg. Fashion, once again, managed to spiral out of control. In the late 1400s, German nobles began wearing towering hats, conical, layered, and sometimes stuffed with feathers so large they resembled migrating birds. One duke's hat reportedly reached almost 2 feet in height and required a servant to steady it when he bowed. Naturally, people complained. The city of Augsburg eventually passed a law stating that no man shall wear a hat taller than his own forehead. It was a modest attempt at reason, But when questioned why such an oddly specific measurement was chosen, the clerk replied, "Because everyone's forehead is different, and so shall be their pride." Which, frankly, deserves to be embroidered on a pillow. The turnip ban of Mainz. You'd think banning a vegetable would be straightforward. But no, the city of Mainz in the 1200s forbade the sale of turnips within its walls. No one knows why. The records simply state, "Let no man bring turnips to market, for they have caused offense." Some believe it was symbolic, turnips being seen as peasant food, unworthy of a prosperous city. Others think a bad harvest caused food poisoning, and the vegetable got scapegoated. One popular theory suggests that someone carved an obscene shape out of one, and that was the end of it. Whatever the reason, Mainz effectively outlawed root vegetables for over 30 years. A strange, hungry chapter in German culinary history. The owl ban of Utrecht. In medieval Utrecht, owls were considered ill omens, messengers of death. So in 1317, the local council issued a rule: no citizen may harbor or display an owl within the city walls. At first, that seems reasonable if you're afraid of superstition. But the ban specifically mentioned paintings, carvings, or likenesses of owls, too. Even embroidered ones. This created an unfortunate scandal when a wealthy merchant commissioned a tapestry showing the Virgin Mary beneath a starry sky. Hidden among the stars was a tiny owl, an artistic flourish that got him fined heavily for symbolic mischief. For a century afterward, the owl simply vanished from local art. Not out of fear of the bird, but fear of bureaucracy. The goose hat ban of Scotland. Scotland, around 1450, had a brief and baffling ban involving hats made from geese. Apparently, certain nobles had taken to wearing hats adorned with full goose wings, spread dramatically across the head like a pair of angelic earmuffs. They were impressive, and deeply impractical in wind. After one particularly gusty funeral, a noble's hat reportedly detached and attacked a bishop. The bishop survived, but his patients did not. The church declared goosewing hats symbols of arrogance and banned them from all public ceremonies. It was never officially repealed. Which means, technically, wearing a goose on your head in medieval Scotland remained illegal for several centuries. The cat ban of Würzburg. Würzburg, 1489. The bishop's palace had a rat problem. So the townsfolk, eager to help, began gifting him cats. Lots of cats. Dozens of them. Within weeks, the palace was overrun. Servants complained of fur in the kitchens, paw prints on the altars, and one particularly mischievous cat who enjoyed stealing the bishop's ring. The bishop, mortified, declared that no further cats shall be brought into the palace or its gardens. The decree spread to the entire town: no cat shall dwell within 50 paces of the episcopal grounds. Of course, without cats, the rat problem returned almost immediately. The bishop blamed the devil. The bell ban of Dijon. Not all bans were about mischief. Some were simply about peace and quiet. In 1392, Dijon banned excessive bell ringing. The problem wasn't the churches, it was the merchants. They'd started using small handbells to advertise goods. The streets were filled with clanging, chiming, and general auditory chaos. The city council issued a statement: let bells serve the Lord alone, not the market. For a while, trade suffered. Then, quietly, the merchants invented a loophole: rattles. Technically not bells, therefore perfectly legal. Thus, Dijon solved one noise problem by inventing another. The bread ban of Avignon. There's something endearing about how medieval authorities handled food. They took it very personally. In Avignon, sometime in the 1300s, a baker named Pierre was accused of selling bread that was too light for its coin. Essentially, underweight loaves. When brought before the magistrate, he argued that the flour was blessed by air, therefore lighter, but spiritually superior. The court was unconvinced. Pierre was fined, and a new rule was written. No baker shall sell bread lighter than the weight of his own hand. Unfortunately, bakers have different hands. The result was chaos, a city full of wildly inconsistent loaves. Eventually, the rule was quietly erased and replaced with actual measurements. Progress, in its slowest form. The whistling ban of Bruges. In Bruges, whistling was briefly illegal. Around 1470, city watchmen complained that thieves were using coded whistles to signal each other at night. So the magistrates decided the easiest solution was simply to ban all nocturnal whistling. The problem was, people liked to whistle. Especially drunk people. For years, tavern owners had to hire listeners, small boys paid to shush customers before they stepped outside. One traveler recorded that Bruges, after sunset, was the city of silence and hiccups. The cloud ban of Florence. This one may be apocryphal, but it's too good to ignore. According to a 14th century letter, a Florentine priest once tried to ban clouds. At least, symbolically. There had been weeks of rain. The crops were drowning, morale was low, and sermons were full of doom. The priest, fed up, led a procession into the streets and read a proclamation forbidding the clouds from returning under pain of excommunication. He then rang the church bell for 7 hours straight. The rain stopped the next day. Which, of course, convinced everyone it had worked. The decree was written down, and that's why it survives, centuries later, in a dusty archive labeled simply, "Ban against clouds, effective immediately." The pumpkin ban of Bavaria. In Bavaria, around the 1500s, pumpkins were considered vulgar. Too orange, too strange, and, according to one chronicle, disturbing to the humors. When imported seeds began producing enormous, lumpy fruits, people got nervous. A rumor spread that pumpkins grew from cursed soil, since their insides looked like brains of beasts. So the Duke of Bavaria banned them outright, calling them vegetable abominations. A century later, pumpkins were reintroduced under a new name, melons of the earth. Everyone loved them. No one mentioned the old decree. The echo ban of Styria. And finally, perhaps my favorite, the echo ban. In a small Styrian valley in Austria, there's record of a local priest banning the calling of voices into the mountains. Why? Because the echoes, he said, were mocking spirits. Children were forbidden to shout or sing outdoors, lest they awaken false replies. It's oddly poetic, the idea of a whole valley kept quiet for fear of hearing itself. The ban lasted until the 1700s, when it was quietly forgotten. The mountains, I imagine, were relieved. The medieval mind was never short on imagination. Every ban we've drifted through tonight, from singing fish to arrogant hats, was a little window into how people coped with the unknown. When the world felt confusing, they wrote rules. When something frightened them, they outlawed it. And when all else failed, they blamed the turnips. It's easy to laugh now, safely modern, surrounded by reason and light. But somewhere deep down, that same instinct remains, the quiet fear of change, the urge to tidy the chaos of life by declaring, "This is forbidden." And yet, like everything human, those laws faded. The bans were forgotten. The echoes returned. The snails, presumably, raced again. So, if you're still awake, or if you're already halfway to dreaming, imagine those medieval towns now silent, their absurd laws tucked away in the dust of old ledgers. The candles burn out. The cobblestones cool. And the bans, one by one, dissolve into laughter. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? That's fine. You've made it through snails, hats, turnips, and owls. Now we're drifting into something softer, the world of royal fears. and the strange things kings and queens once banned simply because they couldn't handle joy. This is the part of history where power becomes fragile. Where the people at the top, with everything they could ever want, start forbidding the things that made life worth living: laughter, love, music, and sometimes even sleep. Because what else do you do when you're afraid of being ordinary? You outlaw happiness. The ban on laughter, Philip II of Spain. Let's start with a man who was allergic to joy. Philip II of Spain. He ruled one of the richest empires on earth. And yet, his court felt like a monastery designed by an accountant. Philip banned laughter. Not officially, of course. He didn't post a sign that said "no chuckling." But he declared that levity and mirth are unbecoming of God's chosen. So everyone stopped smiling. Courtiers practiced blank expressions. One ambassador described the palace as a place where jokes come to die quietly. Philip was deeply devout, painfully repressed, and physically unwell. He believed that laughter was a crack through which the devil entered the soul. He once scolded a servant for grinning at a dog, saying, "Joy is the beginning of error." Imagine a place so serious that even dogs learn to behave. He died surrounded by priests and documents, having successfully removed joy from his orbit, and, apparently, from his kingdom. The ban on dancing, England under the Puritans. When Oliver Cromwell seized power in the mid-1600s, he decided the English had been having far too much fun. Theaters were closed. Maples were chopped down. Dancing, he said, was the lewd motion of the limbs, most improper for a nation seeking God. So dancing was banned. Even in private. Music without words was suspicious. Songs with words were worse. Weddings were silent. Christmas was cancelled. The logic was that pleasure led to sin, and sin led to downfall. Naturally, people did it anyway, quietly, behind closed doors. There are records of secret tavern dances disguised as prayer meetings. People would gather, lower their heads solemnly, and then start tapping their feet under the benches. Historians like to say the Puritans removed joy from English life. Which isn't quite fair. They didn't remove it. They just forced it underground, where it pulsed stronger, waiting for permission to breathe again. The ban on love, Frederick William I of Prussia. Frederick William I, the soldier king, wasn't fond of romance. He loved discipline, drill, and tall soldiers. Mostly tall soldiers. He measured men by their height and once said, "A handsome man is wasted unless he stands over 6 feet." He built an entire regiment called the Potsdam Giants, men so tall they were practically mythical. But when it came to love, he found it inefficient. He banned his officers from marrying before 30, claiming that affection weakened the spine. He also tried to arrange his son Frederick's marriage by force, to a woman the boy despised. When young Frederick tried to flee, the king arrested him and executed his best friend as a warning. Frederick the father never understood Frederick the son. He wanted an army. He got a philosopher who played the flute. After his father's death, Frederick the Great lifted the bans. He allowed music, friendship, even art. But he never married. Some wounds, once carved by fear, never quite heal. The ban on pleasure, Louis XIV's later years. Louis XIV, the Sun King, wasn't always dour. In his youth, he was a creature of spectacle, golden halls, velvet beds, endless banquets. Versailles itself was built as a physical embodiment of "look at me." But as he aged, the light dimmed. His teeth fell out. His legs swelled. And guilt crept in like damp air. He started banning the very pleasures he'd once embodied. Theater performances were restricted. Ballets shortened. Wine watered down. His courtiers, once radiant peacocks, began dressing more modestly, speaking softly. The king had decided that pleasure displeased God, and naturally, everyone followed. At night, he would pray for forgiveness for his own magnificence. He died surrounded by golden mirrors, muttering apologies to heaven for enjoying them. The ban on music, Charles VI of France. Charles VI is known by a kinder nickname, Charles the Mad. He ruled France in the late 1300s, a time of plague, paranoia, and whispering courtiers. One day, during a feast, the king suddenly banned all instruments. No reason was given. He simply shouted, "Silence! They mock me!" From that day on, he couldn't bear the sound of music. He believed it carried secret messages, that his enemies were speaking to him through the lute strings. He ordered all musicians to leave the court, and for years, the palace remained eerily silent. The courtiers obeyed. When the king walked through the halls, they bowed without speaking. When he ate, no one dared scrape a chair. He began dressing in iron, convinced his body would shatter otherwise. When he died, France wept, partly for the man, but mostly for the quiet. The ban on mirrors, End of Bohemia. End of Bohemia, Queen Consort of England in the 14th century, was said to have hated her own reflection. She once declared that mirrors are instruments of vanity and falsehood. So, in her personal chambers, none were allowed. Ladies-in-waiting who brought small looking glasses were reprimanded. Even polished silver was covered with cloth. She claimed it was piety. But courtiers whispered that she feared aging, or worse, that she'd begun to see things in the glass that weren't quite her. After her death, mirrors returned to court. But one account says her rooms remained mirrorless for years, because servants insisted she still lingered there, unseen. Sometimes a ban says less about power, and more about loneliness. The ban on nightfall, Emperor Wenzong of Tang. Let's drift east for a moment. To China, 9th century. Emperor Wenzong of the Tang dynasty, refined, poetic, and chronically anxious. After surviving an assassination attempt at night, he developed an irrational fear of darkness. He ordered the palace to remain fully lit from sunset to dawn. Anyone caught dimming a lamp was punished. He banned nightfall, in essence, declaring, "Let no shadow enter the imperial city." The court obeyed. Oil and candles burned endlessly. The gardens glowed with artificial day. Birds stopped sleeping. Flowers wilted. Eventually, Wenzong grew ill from exhaustion. He'd created a world where no one could rest. When he finally died, the lights were snuffed for the first time in years, and the court described it as the first true night in living memory. The ban on wine, Queen Margaret of Navarre. Margaret of Navarre was brilliant, philosophical, and slightly paranoid about human weakness. After seeing one too many noblemen collapse face first into their goblets, she banned wine from her court entirely. Water only. For everyone. At first, people pretended to approve. It was seen as moral, temperate, enlightened. But soon, the courtiers began sneaking grapes into their water jugs. Then fermented grapes. Then actual wine disguised as holy cordial. The queen eventually found out. Instead of punishing anyone, she quietly reinstated the wine and added more water to hers. She said she had realized something profound. Man cannot be sober in a world this foolish. The ban on touch, King John of England. John, the unpopular one, the one who lost Normandy and annoyed everyone enough to create the Magna Carta. He was also a man who, according to chroniclers, loathed the touch of others. He banned servants from handing him food directly. Platters had to be placed on the floor for him to pick up. He refused to shake hands, bow too closely, or even let his barber approach within 2 paces. He believed physical contact carried curses. Once, when a monk brushed his sleeve, John reportedly burned the robe and ordered a day of fasting. Some thought it was superstition. Others thought he simply hated people. Both explanations seem entirely plausible. The ban on weddings, Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV of Russia had a complicated relationship with marriage. He had 8 wives. Most ended badly. After his 4th marriage, the Orthodox Church refused to recognize any more unions. Ivan ignored them. But when his later wives began dying mysteriously, one poisoned, another drowned, he decided it was a sign. Marriage itself, he concluded, was cursed. So he banned weddings at court. Not just his own, everyone's. For 5 years, no noble in Moscow could marry without his permission. The city grew quiet, lonely, and paranoid. When he eventually lifted the ban, the first wedding reportedly turned into a wild, chaotic celebration, as if the entire capital was trying to remember how to be happy again. The ban on sleep, Charles V of France. And finally, the most human ban of all. Charles V, another French king, feared sleep. He believed the devil whispered to him in dreams. So he stopped sleeping. For days, then weeks. His servants tried to lull him with music, he banned it. They offered him herbal remedies, he banned those too. He would sit awake, reciting prayers, pacing the halls of the Louvre by candlelight. Eventually, he collapsed mid-prayer. His last recorded words were, "Do not let me dream." You can almost feel the exhaustion radiating across time, a man so frightened by his own mind that he tried to live without rest. And in doing so, he became a perfect emblem of royal paranoia, awake forever, ruling over nothing but shadows. If you're still here, still listening, then congratulations. You've drifted through a gallery of bans, each more absurd, each more human. Kings and queens forbidding laughter, music, touch, or night, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid. Of temptation. Of loss. Of themselves. In a way, their decrees were lullabies of control, ways to make a vast, uncertain world just a little quieter. And though centuries have passed, we still do it. Still draw invisible lines between what feels safe and what doesn't. So maybe, as you close your eyes, you can imagine those kings and queens finally setting down their quills. The torches fade. The halls grow still. And somewhere in the soft dark, laughter returns. Because you can't really ban joy. You can only delay it. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? That's fine. You've drifted through the bans on laughter, music, and even sleep itself. Now we'll sink a little deeper into the quiet vanity of the past, a world where luxury was not just a pleasure, but a crime. Tonight, we're walking softly through the grand halls and dim markets of medieval Europe, where the powerful tried to control not just behavior, but beauty itself. The color of your clothes. The shine of your shoes. The way your body smelled. Because nothing worried a medieval monarch more than the thought of someone else looking too impressive. The ban on purple. Let's begin with purple. Not the friendly lavender of old curtains. No, royal purple. Tyrian purple, made from crushed sea snails, so rare and expensive that it was once worth its weight in silver. In ancient Rome, only the emperor could wear it. By the medieval period, the tradition had become law across much of Europe. In England, under Edward III, purple was reserved for the royal family alone. The law read, "No person shall presume to wear cloth of purple, upon pain of forfeiture and imprisonment." People took it seriously. Tailors could be fined for even owning purple dye. Merchants who imported it had to declare the exact buyer, lest they be accused of treasonous fabric enthusiasm. There are stories of nobles secretly mixing tiny drops of purple into their blue garments, just to feel rebellious. A small act of defiance, the medieval equivalent of wearing designer knockoffs. So if you ever find yourself in a medieval crowd, remember, the one in purple isn't fashionable. He's either royalty or about to be arrested. The ban on gold buttons. Fashion has always been an arms race, and gold was its favorite weapon. Buttons, in particular, became a problem. In 1363, the English Parliament declared that no man below the rank of knight shall wear buttons of gold or silver. Apparently, too many merchants and minor gentry had been strutting about like peacocks, sparkling in the sun. The nobility found it unbearable. So the crown decided to legislate humility. Of course, the wealthy middle class found loopholes. They started coating wood buttons in thin layers of gold leaf and calling them gilded by accident. Others used copper polished so bright it looked sinful. When inspectors came to check garments, tailors would simply dust the buttons with soot. The law stayed on the books for nearly a century, unenforceable and quietly mocked. There's something timeless about that, the powerful banning glitter, and the rest of us pretending we don't shine. The ban on long shoes. Fashion, at times, is a cry for help. And nowhere was that clearer than in the 14th century obsession with pointed shoes. They were called polanes. Soft leather slippers with toes that curled upward, sometimes reaching lengths of 20 inches. They flopped as you walked. They tangled in stairs. They made kneeling nearly impossible. Naturally, everyone wanted them. The Pope condemned them. Kings banned them. In 1368, Charles V of France declared that no shoe shall exceed 2 inches beyond the foot. But nobles found it hilarious to measure the law literally. So they began wearing shoes exactly 2 inches longer, shaped into sharp horns. Some stuffed them with moss to keep the shape. Others attached bells to the tips, for what purpose, no one knows. A German monk called them Satan's talons. He wasn't entirely wrong. When plague swept through Europe, moralists blamed the shoes. God, they said, had punished a continent for walking so foolishly. And yet, the style returned, century after century. Because if history teaches anything, it's that banning something only makes people want it more. The ban on perfume. In medieval Paris, a city that smelled largely of horse, sewage, and hope, perfume was an act of mercy. But in the 13th century, a bishop declared it the devil's disguise. Perfume, he said, encouraged vanity, and worse, seduction. Soon after, the city council passed a decree forbidding commoners from wearing strong and deceitful scents. It didn't work. Merchants simply began selling holy waters, perfumes renamed and blessed for plausible deniability. Even the clergy got creative. There are records of priests using rose oil to sweeten the soul during sermon. Officially, it was spiritual. Unofficially, it helped with body odor during summer masses. Eventually, the church gave up. Paris went back to smelling marginally better. The ban on feathers. Few things irritated medieval moralists more than feathers. They were flashy, pointless, and popular, a dangerous combination. Sumptuary laws across Europe often limited who could wear plumes. In Florence, only knights and nobles were permitted to display ostrich feathers. In England, the limit was 1 feather per hat, 2 for the wealthy. 3 was considered an affront to God. Naturally, everyone ignored it. There are illustrations of merchants in extravagant feathered caps, staring smugly into the distance as if daring divine punishment. One chronicler from Venice complained that even barbers strut like falcons. Which sounds magnificent, to be honest. When feathers were banned, ribbons took their place. Then ribbons were banned, and jewels returned. It was a constant cycle, beauty outlawed, beauty reborn. The ban on silk. Silk was the ultimate luxury. Imported from the East, impossibly smooth, and ruinously expensive. For centuries, European monarchs tried to control it. Only nobles of certain ranks could wear silk. Peasants, clergy, and tradesmen were strictly forbidden. In England, violators could be fined the value of the garment, sometimes more. In Florence, wearing foreign silk without permission could even result in imprisonment. Yet silk smuggling was rampant. Entire families worked at night, unpicking imported cloth to hide it in bundles of wool. Inspectors learned to jab needles into shipments. If the needle glided smoothly, it was silk, and the owner was in trouble. Ironically, the very kings who banned silk often wore it head to toe. Hypocrisy, too, was woven finely. The ban on black. It may surprise you that black, the color of elegance and authority, was once off limits. In the early Middle Ages, black dye was unstable, expensive, and associated with mourning. Only clergy were allowed to wear it, and even then, sparingly. Lay people who dressed in black were accused of mocking the cloth. But by the 15th century, black had become fashionable again. Spanish nobles began wearing deep, matte black fabrics as a symbol of restraint and wealth, because achieving that color required dozens of dye layers. The French, naturally, panicked. King Charles VII issued a ban on unnaturally dark garments among the lesser classes, claiming it spread gloom and arrogance. So, for a brief period, there was a strange inversion of style, peasants in bright colors, nobles in mourning hues. Like a masquerade of class, performed daily. The ban on food colors. Medieval banquets were works of edible art. Cooks used saffron, spinach, and crushed violets to tint their dishes, bright yellow chickens, green pies, blue eggs. But eventually, the church said it was too much. In 1311, a council in Avignon ruled that the art of false color in food is vanity. Food, they argued, should look like food, not stained glass. Of course, the rich didn't stop. They simply declared their colored feasts to be theological allegories. Blue pies symbolized heaven. Gold chickens represented purity. God, conveniently, had excellent taste. The ban on mirrors, again. By the late medieval period, mirrors had become slightly more common. Not full reflections, but polished metal discs, enough to glimpse your face in vague confusion. Some cities banned them outright. Venice, Florence, and Siena each passed moral laws limiting their use to barbers and artists. For everyone else, mirrors were considered tools of vanity. Yet artisans began disguising them as devotional objects, tiny reflective icons of saints or angels. You'd hold them up to pray, and coincidentally check your hair. It's hard to suppress human nature. Even in a world that feared reflection, people found ways to look. The ban on pearls. Pearls, soft and natural, were thought to represent purity. Until they didn't. By the 14th century, too many nobles had begun sewing pearls into everything: hats, gloves, even shoes. One Venetian law complained that the streets glitter excessively. So, pearls were restricted. Only women of noble birth could wear them, and only on ceremonial occasions. But Venice was a city of loopholes. Merchants began using glass beads made to imitate pearls. They called them tears of the lagoon. The style spread across Europe. By trying to monopolize beauty, the elite had accidentally democratized it. The ban on sumptuary enforcement. Eventually, the absurdity caught up with itself. In England, after decades of contradictory dress codes, Parliament issued a final decree. No man shall be harassed by officers concerning the cut or color of his garments. In short, they banned the bans. It was a small surrender to reason. A quiet admission that people would always chase beauty, regardless of rank. And so, the long medieval war between luxury and law ended not with a rebellion, but with a shrug. It's easy to smile at these old rules, at kings who feared color, priests who outlawed scent, nobles terrified of feathers. But underneath it all was something very human: the anxiety of being seen. For the powerful, visibility was dangerous. For everyone else, invisibility was unbearable. So they danced between the two, covering themselves in gold, then repenting for it, banning beauty, then secretly adoring it. Maybe that's why these stories still feel familiar. We've simply traded silk for screens, mirrors for filters, and royal decrees for algorithms. But the impulse is the same. To control how we appear. To rank worth by what we wear. And somewhere, beneath the endless rules and quiet defiance, humanity keeps shimmering, too stubborn to stay dull. So, as the night settles deeper and your eyes grow heavy, imagine the torches of those ancient courts flickering out. The purple robes folded away. The shoes untied. And the laws, one by one, forgotten. Because beauty, like laughter, never stays banned for long. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? That's fine. You've wandered through bans on laughter, luxury, and even the color of your shoes. Now, let's open the door to a quieter room, one filled with the soft clatter of plates, candlelight glinting on pewter, and the faint smell of something off. Because tonight, we're sitting down to dine with the past. And in the medieval world, dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a statement of power. And sometimes, a crime. The ban on eating meat during Lent. It began with piety, but ended in absurdity. For 40 days before Easter, meat was forbidden, no pork, beef, or poultry. Not even eggs or dairy in many places. The church demanded sacrifice, but the wealthy didn't like the taste of humility. So they got creative. Records from 15th century France describe nobles feasting on mock meat. Fish molded into the shape of roasted chickens, with almond paste bones. Cooks painted them golden with saffron and served them with a straight face. In some monasteries, the hypocrisy was exquisite. One monk wrote, "We eat no flesh, only the fish that swims within the stew of meat." The church noticed. So did God, presumably. And more bans followed, on butter, cheese, even rich sauces. Eventually, Pope Urban V had to issue an official warning. Let not cunning cooks turn Lent into a carnival. They did, of course. Because hunger finds loopholes faster than faith. The ban on eating beavers. Yes. Beavers. And yes, they were eaten, but only because of a technicality. During the Middle Ages, scholars debated what counted as meat. Fish was allowed during Lent, because it swam. So when someone noticed that beavers also swam, well, logic took a dive. In 1638, the Catholic Church declared that beavers counted as fish for purposes of fasting. Apparently, their tails were scaly enough. So, across Europe, devout Christians tucked into roasted beaver with clear consciences. Even bishops enjoyed it. One called the tail a delicacy most pleasing to the Lord. The animals didn't share the sentiment. Their numbers plummeted. And so, in the strange moral arithmetic of the age, holiness was measured in how well you justified a beaver stew. The ban on peasant bread. Bread was the backbone of life. But not all loaves were created equal. In medieval England, white bread, made from fine sifted flour, was reserved for nobles and clergy. The poor ate black bread, dense and dark, baked with rye or barley. In 1266, King Henry III introduced the assize of bread, a law that dictated exactly what kind of bread each social class could buy. If you were caught baking above your station, selling fine white loaves in the wrong district, the punishment could include public whipping or having your bakery destroyed. Imagine that. A world where your bread was a crime scene. Of course, smugglers appeared, hauling sacks of sifted flour through alleys at night. Illegal bakeries flourished in cellars. And somewhere in a smoky back room, someone whispered, "Just one taste of noble bread." It's strangely touching, that rebellion could rise from something as simple as hunger for softness. The ban on garlic and onions. Not because they were unhealthy, but because they were too earthy, too common. In courtly circles, garlic and onions were banned from official banquets. Chroniclers claimed the odor offended noble air. King Henry VIII forbade his cooks from using them in royal dishes, calling them vulgar roots. Even love was legislated, the French etiquette books warned. No man shall kiss a lady who hath eaten the garlic of peasants. Yet outside the castle walls, the story was different. Garlic was medicine. It was protection against plague, evil spirits, and terrible cooking. And when plague struck, even the nobles changed their tune. Suddenly, garlic was divine again. History is full of small ironies. The things once banned from the banquet often end up saving lives. The ban on butter. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Butter, that soft, golden comfort, was once outlawed in parts of Europe. During Lent, Catholics were forbidden to eat any animal fats. But in northern lands where olive oil was rare, people faced a dilemma: starve or cheat. So they cheated elegantly. In the 15th century, the people of Saxony paid the Pope for permission to use butter during Lent. The Church, always pragmatic, granted it for a fee. They called it the butter brief, the butter letter. The money funded cathedrals. So, in a strange twist of fate, the glorious Gothic towers of France and Germany were financed partly by butter sins. Every slice of buttered bread, you could say, helped build a church. The ban on drinking water. Yes, water. In many medieval towns, drinking unboiled water was considered dangerous, even sinful, because of the filth that ran through rivers. So people turned to ale and weak wine as their daily drink. But in 13th century Paris, monks tried to impose a ban on drinking ale to excess. The public responded by banning the monks from their taverns. Meanwhile, doctors began warning that too much water could chill the stomach and dampen the soul. By the 15th century, nobles looked down on those who drank plain water at all. It was a peasant's drink, a sign of poverty. And so, the Middle Ages managed to turn hydration into heresy. The ban on certain fish. During Lent, fish was the substitute for meat, but not all fish were welcome. In 1310, the city of Paris banned the sale of sturgeon, calling it the food of kings. Only the monarch could eat it. In England, the same law existed. Every sturgeon caught in royal waters automatically belonged to the crown. So fishermen learned to hide their catch. They'd slice it into pieces, salt it, and sell it as river pork. In Norway, whale meat became a loophole. The church couldn't decide if whales were fish or beasts, so people just ate them in silence and pretended not to notice. When religion meets appetite, language becomes flexible. The ban on eating horse meat. A curious one, born not of hygiene, but belief. In the early Middle Ages, Pope Gregory III banned Christians from eating horse flesh. Why? Because it was associated with pagan rituals, where horses were sacrificed to Odin or Woden. So, the church declared, the eating of the horse is the eating of idolatry. From then on, eating horse became taboo in Christian Europe for nearly 1,000 years. Yet in famine years, the poor ignored it. Because hunger, unlike faith, doesn't debate theology. The ban on spices. At first, spices were sacred. Black pepper, cinnamon, and saffron were symbols of wealth. But by the 14th century, moralists began to grumble that too much flavor was corrupting Christian virtue. In Florence, sermons warned that pepper brings pride. In England, a priest declared that the devil hides in nutmeg. Cities introduced taxes on spice imports so heavy that only nobles could afford them. And so, the poor began using local herbs, thyme, sage, mustard seed, to fake the flavors of the elite. Every banned spice birthed an imitation, Every law inspired a recipe. The kitchen, too, became a place of quiet rebellion. The ban on food that deceives. In the late Middle Ages, a strange culinary movement emerged: illusion food. Pastry castles, roasted peacocks stitched back into their feathers, pies that released live birds when cut open. The church hated it. In 1330, a moral council declared, "Let no cook make deceitful meats that mimic other creatures." But kings adored the spectacle. Feasts became theaters. A roasted pig might arrive wearing armor. A pie might sing. The line between miracle and mockery blurred completely. When guests gasped, hosts smiled. They'd broken the rule and looked magnificent doing it. The ban on too much food. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins. So naturally, it was everywhere. Kings banned excessive feasting, then hosted 7-course dinners. Monks preached moderation, then grew round as barrels. In 1419, the city of Lubeck banned banquets exceeding 3 meats and 4 wines. But guests found creative workarounds, calling dishes soups instead of meats, or pouring multiple wines into the same cup. Humans are remarkably inventive when guilt is on the menu. The ban on eating in silence. One of the strangest. In several monastic orders, silence during meals was strictly enforced: no speaking, no laughter. But some abbeys went further, forbidding total silence. They said it invited demonic whispers. So monks were required to hum softly or recite prayers while eating. Imagine rows of hooded men, chewing bread, murmuring psalms through the steam of cabbage soup. Discipline and absurdity, perfectly balanced. The ban on forks. It wasn't just food that was policed, it was how you ate it. When forks first arrived from Byzantium in the 11th century, Europeans were scandalized. Theologians declared them an insult to God's gift of fingers. A Venetian princess who used a golden fork was denounced by priests. When she later died of plague, one preacher declared it divine punishment for her metallic pride. It took centuries for the fork to recover its reputation. Until then, fingers ruled the table, and knives doubled as cutlery and weaponry. Dinner, quite literally, was dangerous. The ban on feeding the poor. Perhaps the darkest ban of all. During times of famine, some lords forbade peasants from entering their lands to hunt, fish, or even gather fallen grain. In 1315, during Europe's Great Famine, several nobles posted guards around their estates to stop the trespass of beggars. To feed the starving without permission could result in prison, or worse. And yet, countless cooks, monks, and mothers did it anyway. They risked their lives to bake illegal loaves and pass them through fences at night. Not all heroes wore armor. Some just carried bread. When you trace your fingers through these old laws, you see the same pattern again and again. A world trying to control hunger, beauty, and desire through decree. And always failing. Because you can't truly ban appetite. Not for food. Not for color. Not for life. The bans become stories. The rules fade into laughter. And the people, the quiet, hungry people, always find a way to eat. So tonight, if you find yourself drifting to sleep, imagine the glow of a medieval kitchen, a single fire burning under stone arches, a cook sneaking a spoonful of butter into a forbidden stew. Somewhere, far in the past, someone just like you took a bite and smiled at the taste of defiance. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? Good. You've made it this far through the mud and madness of medieval bans, from forbidden forks to outlawed butter. But now, we're slipping into something softer. Quieter. The part of history where kings and clerics tried to ban not weapons or food, but happiness itself. You see, the Middle Ages were not only ruled by steel and scripture. They were ruled by the suspicion that joy might be dangerous. That laughter, dancing, and music could loosen the soul, maybe even invite sin. And, naturally, someone always took that idea too far. The ban on dancing in churchyards. Let's begin in the heart of France, sometime around the 1200s. Churchyards weren't just for funerals. They were public spaces, markets, gatherings, celebrations. And sometimes, impromptu dance floors. After a long mass, villagers would spill into the grass, the bells still ringing, and start dancing. Men, women, children, all spinning around gravestones, laughing, forgetting the cold world for a moment. But the priests hated it. They called it blasphemous frolicking. In 1209, a council in Paris declared that no man shall dance in the shadow of holy ground, nor make mirth where souls rest. The punishment? Public confession, fasting, and, in some cases, paying for repairs if your feet damaged a grave. Still, the people kept dancing. So the church threatened excommunication. It didn't work either. Because even in death's garden, life insists on moving its feet. The ban on dancing entirely, the dancing plague. If that sounds extreme, wait until we reach Strasbourg, in the summer of 1518. It began with one woman, Frau Trophia. She walked into the street and began to dance. No music, no partner, no reason. Within days, dozens joined her. They danced in heat, in exhaustion, until their feet bled. Some collapsed. Some died. The city panicked. Doctors called it hot blood. Priests called it sin. And the city council, naturally, banned all dancing, everywhere. Ironically, they also hired musicians to calm the dancers down. It did not work. To this day, no one quite knows what happened: hysteria, poison, mass delusion. But the result was the same. For decades afterward, dancing in public was forbidden. Imagine living in a world where joy itself was considered a disease. The ban on laughter in monasteries. In the silence of stone cloisters, even a chuckle could be a crime. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and still followed by countless monks, explicitly forbade immoderate laughter. A monk was to keep his face solemn, his words few, and his heart always trembling before God. Laughter, they believed, opened the door to pride. Pride led to sin. Sin led to eternal paperwork. So monasteries became worlds of whispered words and pressed lips. Some orders allowed a faint smile, called a holy joy. But a laugh loud enough to echo off a wall? That was grounds for punishment. One chronicler from Cluny wrote, "A brother who laughs in the refectory must kneel upon the floor and beg forgiveness of his brethren." You can almost hear it, that stifled giggle echoing under the arches, quickly smothered by the weight of eternity. The ban on music in Lent. Lent again, always the enemy of fun. During the Holy Weeks, music was banned in many towns. No instruments. No dancing. No singing outside of hymns. But the taverns didn't care. In one German town, records show that 2 innkeepers were arrested for fiddling during forbidden days. Their defense? We only fiddled softly. It didn't help. Authorities began patrolling streets, listening for laughter or music through shutters. One bishop declared that even the hum of string or drum awakens demons. But music, like hunger, finds its way through cracks. People sang quietly in kitchens, played soft melodies in barns, and hummed while they baked bread. When you suppress joy long enough, it simply hides inside other sounds. The ban on love songs. Love was complicated in the medieval mind. It could be holy, or it could lead you to ruin. In 1273, King Philip III of France banned vain songs of courtly love in public spaces. Troubadours, those wandering poets with lutes and questionable fashion choices, were ordered to stick to moral themes. Naturally, they didn't. They just rewrote their lyrics using coded metaphors. Instead of "I love her eyes," they sang, "The dawn star shines beyond the mountain." Everyone knew what it meant. The bands only made their art cleverer. Censorship, it turns out, often inspires poetry. The ban on ungodly dancing. In England, 1319, Bishop Stapledon of Exeter issued an unusually detailed decree. No man or woman shall dance in taverns, in barns, or in the streets after sundown. The reason? Apparently, many sins arise from the circling of feet. He wasn't wrong. Dancing often led to courtship, and courtship led to very medieval consequences. But the ban went further. He declared that anyone caught dancing could be fined or made to stand outside the church barefoot during Mass. Villagers responded by dancing anyway, but calling it walking in rhythm. The law couldn't touch rhythm. It never can. The ban on Christmas plays and carols. Yes, even Christmas. It wasn't always a cheerful season. By the 15th century, Christmas had become so rowdy that church leaders began banning mumming, the street plays and songs people performed. They called it foolery. In 1443, the City of London outlawed all disguisings and carolings in the streets. Too much joy, apparently. Too many poor people pretending to be kings. But behind closed doors, families still sang. Quietly, softly, around fires. That's how carols survived, not through royal approval, but through whispers in cold rooms. It's comforting, somehow, to know that Christmas was saved by stubbornness. The ban on bells. Yes, church bells. The sound of time itself. During the Black Death, so many bells were rung for funerals that city leaders in several regions banned them altogether, fearing the noise would drive people mad. In England, one town declared, "Let no bell ring save for the hour of prayer, lest sorrow multiply." Silence spread, eerie, heavy, like the absence of breath. For months, the only sound in some villages was the wind through the graveyards. When the bans were finally lifted, the bells rang again, and people wept. Sometimes, the absence of sound teaches us how much life it carries. The ban on street singing. It started with one song. In 14th century Florence, a group of young men began wandering through the city at night, serenading their lovers. It was charming at first, until a bishop's niece became the subject of a particularly passionate ballad. The scandal was immediate. Florence banned all-night singing in 1357. Violators could be fined, or, in one memorable case, dunked in the river for disturbing the peace of virgins. Still, they sang. Because some things simply sound better under moonlight. The ban on jesters in church. Medieval jesters were the comedians of their time, sometimes wise, often drunk, and always dangerous to authority. But in 1248, a French bishop banned jesters from performing near churches. They were agents of mockery. He claimed laughter at holy doors drew the devil's breath. One jester famously ignored the ban. He performed a parody sermon outside the cathedral gates, complete with fake relics, a toy bishop's hat, and a stuffed goose named Saint Honk. He was arrested, of course. But the crowd adored him. The church eventually gave up trying to police jokes. Because humor, like sin, can't be excommunicated. The ban on music in taverns. You'd think taverns were safe. They were, after all, built for noise. But in the 15th century, during a moral panic in England, authorities banned minstrels and drummers from taverns after dark. They said it encouraged riot and lewdness. The tavern owners protested. So the city compromised. Music was allowed again, but only songs without sin. Which, as one chronicler noted, left very few songs indeed. The ban on festivals. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had a festival for everything: saints, harvests, coronations, random miracles, even the invention of wine. But after centuries of plagues and wars, kings began to view crowds as dangerous. In 1389, the English crown banned unlicensed festivals, meaning any gathering not directly controlled by the church or state. It was a strange, gray world that followed, towns too afraid to celebrate, people too cautious to laugh. Yet in the margins of the law, festivals continued, tiny ones, secret ones. A family feast. A musician playing in a barn. A child dancing on a table when no one was looking. Joy survived in whispers. There's something beautiful in all this repression. Not in the cruelty, of course, but in the persistence of the human spark beneath it. For every law written to silence, someone hummed louder. For every ban on dancing, someone tapped their foot in secret. For every decree against laughter, someone couldn't help but laugh anyway. You can't outlaw happiness. You can only delay it. So as you drift off tonight, imagine a dark medieval tavern, shutters closed, candles burning low, a fiddler quietly tuning his instrument despite the ban. He glances around, smiles at the silence, and begins to play. Outside, the guards pass by, hearing nothing. Inside, the music fills the room, soft, defiant, alive. And somewhere, deep down in the bones of history, you can still hear that sound. The music that refused to die. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. Another long, strange, faintly ridiculous walk through the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed this quiet little journey, tap subscribe, leave a soft comment, or just drift off knowing that history is mostly people ruining good things for everyone else. Good night, and I'll see you next time, somewhere between tragedy and bedtime.